Bam! MC is in the house. What's up, folks? My name is Justin Garcia, also known as Master Chim, and welcome to the Warrior Stream. I'm here every Wednesday at noon Eastern Standard Time, taking a topic deep diving, having a good time while doing it. And today we got a pretty good topic. Before I get into it, though, let me just take care of the housekeeping. If you guys are not getting my emails, masterchimletter.com. Every day I send an email. It has something that I'm going over. I'm keeping people aware of the events, the different, products and services that I'm offering. There's a quote of the day every time. And I make those quotes of the day not always related, most of the time not related to the email itself. So there's always something for everybody on the email. So make sure you're getting them. masterchimletter.com. If you're watching on Facebook right now or on YouTube, there's going to be all the links, the relevant links to my stuff, including my mastermind group, coaching offers, things like that. So you can check that out. So, all right, before we get into the topic of the day, let me say what's up. We got Jesse, what's going on, brother man? Good to see you. Big Phil, good to see you, brother man. Aaron, hello, darling. Hope all is well north of the border. Jamie, your partner in crime. What's up, Jamie? Good to see you. One of my Canadian operatives. Getting a little crazy up in Canada right here. You guys are going through some shit, and as much as I want that to be better for you guys, I will say selfishly that I am glad it is up there and we're not dealing with that right now. Because I heard some of the hate crime stuff that's being pushed up there. And I mean, it's one of many things, but it's an issue. Two on Tom's in the house. What's up, brother man? Good to see you. Always good when Two on Tom pops in. So we got a pretty good topic. I didn't want to present this in any sort of codified, structured way because I thought it would be a reduction of the value of this talk. But today I want to talk about what martial arts is to me. And this is different. This should be looked at differently than what it means in general or what it may mean to you or to somebody else. So just that sort of disclaimer right out of the way. Now, I will say that I think everybody should treat it the way I treated it. Right? So even though I'm with humility saying that, hey, this is just my opinion, I'm also, don't let it be ignored that I'm also saying that my opinion is the best. So let's get into it. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on. Big Frank, what's going on, brother man? I see you there. Good to see you. I want to talk about my relationship with martial arts and some of the things that, introspectively, I've sort of come to some conclusions, like why certain things and certain instincts and drives I have, why they make sense, and how did that all unfold against the backdrop of my experience or my childhood, etc. So I will say that if I'm starting early, it is no surprise that, I have a younger brother, Damien, who pops in every once in a while. And he's about 2.5 years younger than I am. And growing up, I had a little brother to protect. This became, I would say, significant to me because my parents moved a lot with us, right? So we moved at a bunch of different locations. We started off in the Bronx. At some point, they ventured over to California. We spent time in, I believe, Oakland and Berkeley in California. We were there, I think, a total of a year or two. And then we came back. And when we came back, it was the exact reasons, I don't know. For the most part, it was always my father was trying to make as much money as he could. He was trying to find a career. Work was scarce. He was out of the military already, obviously, for some time. He was already trained as an HVAC engineer. But finding work, was difficult. I was born in 1975, so we're talking, 79, 80, maybe 70, 78, 79. So I'm 3-4 years old. Then we moved back to New York. And when we first moved to New York, I believe we moved back to the South Bronx, and we're there for about a year. After the year that we're in the South Bronx, which I'm guessing is 80, maybe, we then went to upstate New York, and we were not too far from Woodstock, New York, for about another year. And money wasn't there. And I think from there, my father finally got what would be the major job of his career, which was working for Mount Sinai Hospital. So we then moved from upstate New York back to the Bronx. And I was in the Bronx up until 10 years ago when my family moved. Right? So moving as much as I did from one second to the next, it was a constant reminder of I was the outsider, looking to, using some of my language now, looking to re-enter a tribe, and finding that from group to group, the tribe was always different. The criteria was different from tribe to tribe. So there was a point where I stopped looking to fit into tribes and looked to basically coexist with these tribes, setting my own criteria for, it's almost like the fuck around and find out, mentality of a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. And it was, I wasn't going to let anybody mess with me, and I couldn't let anybody mess with my brother. I've always been very protective of my younger brother. And that was reflected in how I conducted myself. Fast forward to, I think, 81. And this is my earliest memory of this. Some of these dates might overlap in different ways, but in a general sense, this is as authentic a share of it as I could recall at this point. But I think it was 81, I saw my first ninja movie. Now, there were back in the 80s, the sort of drive-in theater, not a literal drive-in theater, but that was like the name of the show on the TV that showed the Kung Fu flicks. So I remember, being, exposed to Kung Fu flicks. But it was really the ninja movies that really caught my eye. This idea of being and one of the biggest reasons was, and you could tell how, given the backdrop of that I shared already, this idea of somebody who trained in secret with a secret group and was unbeknownst to the outsiders and was capable of great power, but nobody knew it. And he would go and take care of the bad guys, right? And I think the first ninja movie I ever saw was, I think it was Enter the Ninja, which was Sho Kosugi, right? So Sho Kosugi is the guy, right? He's the guy that if you were into ninja movies in the 80s, he was the ninja. And Enter the Ninja was, I think, the first one. And it also starred Franco Nero. I think it was Franco Nero, who also played the original Django in the first Django movie. And he starred in this Enter the Ninja as a sort of expat military guy who moves in with his military buddy and the military buddy's wife. And it might be like the Philippines or Vietnam or one of those fucking countries. And excuse my understanding of where everything is in the world, my geography skills, not my strong suit, but in one of those places. And Sho Kosugi was the bad guy in that. And the only way that he was able to be defeated was the good guy also knew ninja skills. So then it became like this, okay, I could become a ninja too. And that's when I became obsessed. And we're talking 6-7 years old. And back in the day, there were the ninja magazines. A few years ago, I secured all of the ninja magazines. I bought it from a former student who tried to buy them back. Man, you ain't getting them shits back. When I resecured them, I would save up my allowance, pennies, dollars here and there to buy these ninja magazines. Back in the day, they're talking the 80s in the Bronx, you can go to the candy store, which is always the Chinese store, right? So it was a Chinese guy that owned it, but you go to the candy store and they would sell like ninja stars and they probably still do, these candy stores and stuff. But back then, it was against the backdrop of this ninja craze. So I had the ninja outfits. I had the Toby boots, the two-toed boots. I had um, size. I had nunchucks and swords and knives and anything I could get my hands on ninja, I did. And I even at one point, I think I might have been 7 years old. I tried to run away to the botanical gardens because we lived not too far at the time from the New York Botanical Gardens, which is in the Bronx. I lived maybe a half a mile away from it, and I thought I had to be about 7. I'm just going to go and live in the forest of the botanical gardens and become a ninja and start my own ninja clan. So to say that I was all in would be an understatement. This is 7, 8 years old. Fast forward a few years, I don't really get a chance to train martial arts much. My mother had brought me to a sort of like karate class at one point. I think it was held at Lehman College. I was probably 8 years old, 9 years old. And that lasted a couple of weeks and just fell by the wayside. Why? I don't know. Maybe I didn't take to it. Maybe my mother stopped bringing me. Who knows? But that didn't really create any significant influence on me. Yet it was another rep of me trying to become a martial artist. And then one of my cousins, Tiffany, shout out to Tiffany if she's watching. She had a boyfriend at the time who trained in Kung Fu. I think it was Kung Fu. Well, it was labeled Tai Chi Quan, and it was a system that was founded by a guy named J.B. LaPuppet. Any martial arts historians, some of these names might sound familiar. And I think in order to impress my cousin, this boyfriend of hers offered to take me, her younger cousin, to go and train. And this was probably my first real martial arts training experience. And it was in the basement of an apartment building in the South Bronx. I remember, I think we rode our bikes there. So it was in the hood, and it was in one of these basements. And the training was significant. It was, and mind you, at this time, I'm maybe 8, 9 years old. And I remember sparring, and I didn't know how to spar. And I can't say in hindsight that it seemed like some sort of organized system, but everybody there was about this. And I was enamored with this group setting of me being the kid, the junior, presence in this environment. And some people would look to help me out. Some people would look to ignore me. Some people would I remember my cousin's boyfriend. There was one time, and I think this might have been the last time I went. There were some girls there, and he was trying to impress. So he wanted to spar with me or asked me to spar with him. So I can only imagine how disorganized this whole thing was. And he was probably, 17, 18 years old at the time, 10 years older than me, and basically like beat the shit out of me in front of these girls. And I think it was to impress them. And I remember riding my bike home by myself, and I was crying. I was angry, enraged. And I never went back to that. Right. So that was the end of the Tai Chi Quan thing. 9, 10 years old at this point. So 4th, 5th grade. In schools and 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades, I went to Catholic school in the Bronx. In school, I started becoming a problem. I started becoming the kid that had a chip on his shoulder, the kid that was always looking to create a fight out of a disagreement. And that was reflected in a lot of times I had gotten in trouble in school. I don't know how I managed it for life of me, but I've never been suspended. I attribute that maybe to my gift of gab. Once I got, pinched for doing something, I had all the stories and, knew what to say. But I spent a lot of time in detention, and I had a reputation as what I thought as being thought of as, the toughest kid in school. It would be, years later where I realized everybody just probably thought I was an asshole and didn't want to deal with me because not everybody felt like fighting every day when they showed up to school. So I started developing that reputation of Having friends, I was always very athletic, right? So I was always playing sports. So that was a way that I really connected with people socially. But outside of sports and athletics, I was really mostly a loner. I was a guy that had some friends, but maybe would have one friend at a time. That 6 months I'm hanging out with this kid, and then something happens, and I wind up hanging out with this other kid, and against the backdrop of the Bronx too. It's worth noting there's just so many fucking people. It's not like you're forced to really deal with people. And later on, there would be, friendships that I just bailed on and just, was like, all right, fuck that guy. I'm not hanging out with him anymore. And it was always very abrupt. So in school, I'd be getting in trouble, a lot of fights. I remember being 7 years old, and I just told this story recently at a family get together. I had a buddy in second grade whose name was Albert. And I want to say Albert Ramirez, but whatever. He was my buddy in second grade. And I remember in second grade bringing Albert around with me during a recess and going to everybody in the second grade. And I think the school that I was in, which was at the time Our Lady of Refuge in the Bronx, there were a bunch of, there were two classes for second grade classes. So there was my class, and there was a bunch of kids I didn't know, but were also in the second grade. And I remember during recess going with my buddy Albert to every boy in the second grade and challenging them to a fight. And I wanted to be known as the best fighter in second grade. And most of the kids were like, I don't want to fight you, which obviously went in the W column for me. And I had Albert keeping track. He was like the witness to this. And it was like what 7-year-old thinks like this, but that's where I was at 7. And a lot of it, a lot of moving, protecting my brother, getting into fights, being ostracized from social groups, from moving location to location, developing now this love affair with martial arts and ninja mythology and that whole scene of 80s, martial arts movies, the kung fu flicks. All these things started shaping and molding the way that I looked at how I interacted with others. Fast forward now to, let's say, junior high school. I had a pretty decent reputation. In junior high school, I went to John Philip Sousa on Baychester Avenue, and I was in what's called the SPE class, which is, I guess, like the highest scoring, academic class, the nerd class, you could say. And a lot of those people they weren't thugs, they weren't violent, they weren't tough guys. So I was able to socially integrate and interact, and it wasn't, there wasn't people challenging me to fights. I did have fights in the school a couple times. I remember one time my father having to be called in, in the middle of the day to meet with the assistant principal, and I got in trouble for that, both in school and at home. But mostly I'd have fights here and there. I was always ready to fight. I was always willing to fight if it was necessary. But I developed more of a social thing. Then fast forward now to high school. The first high school I went to was Bronx High School of Science. And Bronx High School of Science, there was a culture shock. It was the first time where I think I realized that my family was not well off. We were never poor. I'll say that right up front. We were never poor, but it wasn't until I went to Bronx Science that I was really exposed to just how much money a lot of kids had and grew up around. And, there were kids that were getting picked up by their parents and, these fancy Benzes and BMWs, et cetera. And, some of them had drivers, and there was a lot of money there. It was one of these schools that you had to take a test to get into. And so, at the time, it was one of the best public schools in the country. Black science guy, Neil deGrasse Tyson, went to Bronx Science. But when I got there, it was really, I was frustrated. I was frustrated socially because I realized that my family didn't have what these other families had. And it was the first time, like I said, it was in my face. I remember getting into fights because, like, I would pick fights with people who I was envious of, who I was jealous of maybe. And I would find ways to create narratives that would result in other people pressuring this person to fight me, and I would orchestrate that because just out of emotional jealousy and envy. very weak, slave-minded characteristics. But that's who I was at that time. That was the amount of development that I had managed at that point. I'm in Bronx Science for 2 years, and I'm getting into fights. I'm not going to classes. At the time, there was another school right down the block from Bronx Science called DeWitt Clinton. And DeWitt Clinton's kids would come over, dating myself somewhat, and a very regular thing is they would come here and basically take the beepers, right? Because back then beepers was the thing. And there would be Clinton kids that would come over and steal beepers from science kids. And I, at one point, found like my niche socially, where when Clinton kids came over to rob or just pick on the science kids, they would get me. And I would fight whoever. And usually it was a bunch of bullies. They weren't really about it, but the most of the science kids were just easy pickings. There were a bunch of limping fucking antelopes on the plains, right? And so I found some social significance in being the guy that was the tough guy, was the guy that would fight the Clinton kids. And when I was a freshman, I had a fight the first week of school with a senior who I had bumped into me on the stairs, which wasn't a big deal. And he just went ballistic and threatened to fuck me up and told me, after school, there was the one corner that people fought on across the street. And he said, meet me there. And I remember going, okay, like I wasn't intimidated by this at all. But I didn't know anybody in the school, right? There were one or two kids that I had gone to school with previously that also made it into science. But as soon as we got to science, it's like they never even knew me. And probably vice versa, to be honest. So I didn't have any social groups. After school happens that same day, and that kid's waiting across the street on this corner. He's got a group of friends with him. And I finish last period. I walk out, the door of the high school. I'm by myself. I go across the street. I put my bag down, and I walk into the crowd. And, I guess this is where he thinks like there's some sort of formal beginning to what's about to happen. Like he thought at some point we were going to, okay, so I challenged you and, like there's going to be a ref or something. I put my bag down. I walked in, and as soon as I got up to him, I just punched him right in his jaw and got on top of him and just pounded him. Eventually his friends pulled me off. I didn't get jumped. If this had happened in junior high school next to Edenwald Projects, I would have probably got fucking killed. But I knew these were a bunch of like well-behaved Asian kids at the time. So I'm like, yeah, they're not gonna jump me. And like it would also make their guy look even worse. So I basically had a little bit of strategy to what I was doing. But that fight set the reputation, which snowballed into everything else I had mentioned. Eventually, then I leave that school. I'm transferred out. I wasn't thrown out of science, but my mother was like, listen, we got to get you out of there. And she got me into a school in Westchester, which was Tuckahoe High School. Now, the relevance of this is that in this second high school, they had wrestling. And first week I'm there, I got a chip on my shoulder. This is not in the Bronx now. This is in Westchester, New York, where this school is. And so I'm, the tough guy walking through the hallways. And this short, stocky guy comes up to me and goes, who are you? And I look at him and I go, who are you? And he laughs. And he goes, do you go here? And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like ready to fight. This guy's like in his 30s, mind you. And he goes, look, I'm the wrestling coach. Have you ever wrestled before? I was like, I could wrestle, like whatever. And he's like, well, the season's about to begin. Why don't you come to the wrestling room after school and see if you want to wrestle? So I was like, all right. So I went, and wrestling was like, it was just my natural, skill set. In junior high school, I skipped this. In junior high school, this is 8th grade junior high school. I wrestled in 10th grade. So 8th grade junior high school, I got, we had the PAL, the Police Athletic League. And to my understanding, in the PAL, there's usually two sports. There's basketball, right? And it's pretty much like, yeah, that's going to be a thing. And then whatever other sport, some cop is going to volunteer to facilitate and proctor. Well, the one that I went, I didn't get picked on a basketball team. I was a decent basketball player too, but maybe for obvious reasons, I didn't get picked on a basketball team. So they're like, all right, you're going to do the experimental thing, which was judo. Judo, I fell in love with. And I only did it for whatever a session of the PAL is, 2, 3 months. But the guy had brought me to a bunch of tournaments. I remember winning a couple of tournaments, and I had a knack for it. I was tough, I was agile, and he showed me something, and I could make my body move the way that he showed me. So there was that, that brief affair with judo. Fast forward now to wrestling, it was grappling again, and it was something that I already had an affinity for. I had a little bit of experience with, and although I was not a technical or impressive wrestler at any point at that time, in a month after joining the team, I won my first tournament. Right, I won the Edgemont tournament in Westchester, and it was like, this is what I should be doing. The problem was I couldn't keep up socially, and so I wound up getting arrested. This is when I got locked up eventually, and I got thrown out of the school. I got thrown out of the school not for the reason of me getting arrested, but apparently my parents were, not apparently, I knew it, but it was, they were using an address for me to attend that school. My mother had worked in the area, and she used, one of her friends, basically, she made that was local. She asked to borrow their address for the purposes of getting me and my younger brother in that school. And so when I had gotten arrested, they went to that address to find out that I didn't live there. So the jig was up, so to speak. So I got in trouble legally, got thrown out of the school. Senior year, I just wound up playing football. I stopped fighting as much. I was pretty focused after having been locked up, where I fought almost every day. I wound up, going to my senior year of high school at Evander Childs in the Bronx, and was just focused. I got to get to college. I'm not going to get in trouble anymore. So I was still, reacting to having been released from getting locked up. So I had all that focus and energy. First year of college, I go to Western Connecticut State, and within 2 months, I get thrown out of the dormitories. Why? Because one of these antisocial weirdo kids walking through the hall, I completely bully him. Like, there's the doors that go either way, and I basically pushed through both doors like an asshole. I didn't like the kid just because he was different. No real reason. I was just a fucking asshole all the time. And when I did it, he called me a spick, right? So he's like, fucking spick or something like that. And when he said that, I swung on him, and I wound up breaking his orbital bone. And when I broke his orbital bone, I got arrested by campus police. And I remember being on campus police, and they're asking me what happened. And they're like, did you hit him? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, why? And I remember saying, because he called me a spick. And I thought that was like, okay, they'll take the cuffs off. So, all right, we didn't know that. Let me go. Like, I thought I was good. And they were like, yes, but why'd you hit him? I'm like, I just told you. And so at this age, so mind you, this is like 18 now, I'm still learning that violence is not as easily accepted by society as it is by me. So I wound up, getting thrown out of the dormitories. I only stay at WestCon for a year. I wound up, just college was never a thing for me. Like, it seemed like such an assimilation exercise where I was going to be sort of pressed into this mold, and I was just not malleable enough for that to take. And decided, took classes here and there in other schools, the next couple of years, but never really made anything of it. Fast forward to, this is like 18, 19 years old. Fast forward to about 23, 24 years old. My girlfriend at the time lived 2 blocks away from a martial arts school that had just opened. It was a Taekwondo school. I'm still looking to get back into martial arts at this point. I need a little bit of focus. It always made me feel like I had a purpose when nothing was going right in my life, and in my assessment of it, I could train, right? So this idea of training, I'd always lifted weights, but even lifting weights just had a limit to me. But I saw the opportunity to get back into martial arts. It was 2 blocks from my girlfriend's house. I was like, I'm going to go. I went there and it was like this off the boat plane, Korean guy who I went for 3 days, right? I don't know if it was a trial or I paid for the month, whatever the arrangement was. But the third day that I was in a third class, and it was brutal. Like I kept going back because most of it was just exhausting, and the stretches were like maniacal. The whole do a split. I'm going to stand on your fucking knees so you could do a split for the first time in your life. Like those types of stretches. So to me, this is like I'm always trying to get back to this sort of ninja camp. This I want to be a warrior. I want to do shit that other people don't do. I want to train the way other people don't train. I want to show and prove to myself that I'm tough. There's this perennial search for pressure. Unless I found the pressure, it's like I didn't feel like I was functional. So I love this Korean guy in this Taekwondo school. Now, never mind the fact that I'm 5'5" and built like a fucking Minecraft character. Like the guy had hard training. I was like, I'm going to be here. Well, the third day, a teenager in class, the guy had just started the school not too long before I had joined. There was maybe a dozen students. A teenager who was this obnoxious, spoiled pussy, was talking back to the instructor. This guy's from a Korean, like Taekwondo school in Korea. Like there is no talking back to your instructor. Like this is just so, out of order in the instructor's eyes that he warns the kid once. The kid winds up saying something disrespectful again on the line that we make about to bow out of class or end class. The kid says something like that is a joke or something. To which the instructor replies by headbutting the teenager on his nose, exploding blood everywhere. The kid's standing in line right next to me. When I see the instructor do this and I see the kid falls, he starts crying, there's blood everywhere. Most of the students are like in shock. But I'm like, I am never leaving this instructor. He's the greatest ever. I have found my master. Like that was my reaction. Well, as you can imagine, a day or two after that, the school was shut down and the guy probably hightailed his ass back to Korea. So it's like another chance gone. A couple of years later, I was 25, 26. I decide, I hear about a judo school. Now, the judo school, I've been there a long time. I just had never heard of it. And somebody had mentioned it. I did a little bit of research and I said, you know what? I remember the PAL. I did judo back in 8th grade. Let me try this judo thing out. Maybe it'll take. I felt like I should always be training. Like I needed to do something. When I wasn't training in formal martial arts, I was still hitting heavy bags at the gym. I was still like throwing fucking shuriken into trees. I was still, swinging swords in my house. I felt like I was always training and doing something, but obviously the guidance, the tutelage, the structure wasn't there. So I said, I'm going to go back to the judo school. This was the Tremont School of Judo on Tremont Avenue in the Bronx. When I joined, it was right around the time the founder of the school, Pereira was his last name, had just passed away. And this was the after effects or the post Pereira era of the school. And there was a lot of just chaos. There was his widow, I believe, his black belts, and nobody could really come together on how the school was supposed to run. And as a student who had just joined, I loved the training. Everybody was great, but it was a little bit too chaotic. Now, I didn't quit because of that, but one day, one of the schoolmates that I have in the locker room says, hey, Justin, I'm going to try out one of those Gracie Jiu-Jitsu schools tomorrow. Do you want to come with me? At this point, like a lot of people, I had already heard of, the UFC, the Gracies, etc. So I was like, absolutely. I didn't know there was any around. I went with him the next day and I joined a Helsing Gracie, or I went to a Helsing Gracie association, and it was run by a guy named Mike Casey. And when I went, I got my ass kicked by a couple of guys. I'm maybe 215 at the time. bull in a china shop, could run through a wall strong. And I got my ass kicked by 2, 3 guys, 150 pounds each. And after getting my ass kicked for 2 hours, I was like, I got to learn this. And I wound up joining. I had taken a break at some point, came back. And then it was straight training until I eventually was asked to leave the school and started my own program, what eventually became the Jungle Gym. Now, to the Jungle Gym, the Jungle Gym was always my take on what I thought a martial arts school would be. I guess that's my history. Now let's get into actually what the point of the talk today is centered around. Martial arts, to me, cannot ignore the violence that it is built from. People have been doing violence since the beginning of mankind. Before communication, there was only violence. You look in the natural world, there's a bunch of animals. They can't communicate with one another. So what do? They design hierarchies based on violence. The circle of life, the predator-prey cycle and dynamic, all based on violence. There's not a lot of communication. Well, with martial arts, it is the sort of reclamation of that aspect of who we are as a people, as a species, we could say more generally. And basically the thing that allows us to train for those times where communication doesn't work. So martial arts to me was always preparing an individual, a man, for the inevitable need to move past communication and leverage violence to a necessary outcome. Arts to me was always the sort of codified approach to that, based on a sort of an iterative, error-correcting evolution of techniques and strategies and experiences, localities, attributes. It's like these guys fought like this, and this is why. These guys fought like this, and this is why. When you look at a lot of traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu systems, a lot of it is, kotegash wrist locks and manipulations and stuff. And well, when you add the context of warfare that was done with swords and, what options you had for once you were disarmed or just infighting, in a clinch with swords and being able to manipulate, you start to see why these things develop. The whole lore, and I've never really done independent research, but using farm tools in martial arts came from localities where, those are the only things they had available to them, and needed to learn how to leverage those farm tools as weapons because that's what they had available. So there is an evolution. So the art is, to me, almost like a reproduction or a projection of a people's iterative process with violence. And when I say a people, that means not only the people, but the time and place that they developed it. Right. So the backdrop of this iterative process, like that's the art. It's like I see why Taekwondo is Taekwondo, why karate is karate, why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is different from, Judo, why Judo is different from the precursor of Jiu-Jitsu prior to that. When you start to see the evolution. But to me, I was always plugged in to the violence, meaning that was always the context. Judo is a sport that was developed from jiu-jitsu. Brazilian jiu-jitsu, we could argue, is an art that was developed from a sport. So people started taking judo. When it became Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the reality, context, and accountability was brought back into it. What's lost in a lot of it was still two people having a duel. One of the things that, if you guys have ever seen, Hickson and Hugo Duarte on the beach in Copacabana in Brazil, I think it was in Rio generally, but I think it was Copacabana, they had the beach fight. And like, to me, it's like, man, it's just incredible. That's just like legendary type shit. I'm going to challenge this guy. And, you look at in Troy, Achilles fighting the giant from the other army, and so the groups didn't have to fight. You had these one-on-one representatives that were fighting, and a lot of the Hickson stuff, it was sort of treated like that in my eyes, at least. It's like this guy was so powerful that he could take on their most powerful guy and save all the bigger term. Like, this is heroic violence-based type stuff. But again, it's still two guys dueling in sand, right? This is different from the knives, the guns, the reality that exists out there. So to me, when you look at now specifically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, when I first started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I didn't know that there were gi and no gi tournaments, and there were back in the day. It was the Grappler's Quest and Naga. Naga's still around. But when I first joined, I thought that everybody was training for fighting in the street in case they had to beat up some dude on the beach, like that was the context. And if there was a sport application, it would be Vale Tudo, it would be, mixed martial arts, fighting in the cage, fighting in the ring, what have you. So when I walked, I thought that was the thing. Everybody was getting ready for a fight in the street, or if they wanted to be competitive in a sport environment, they would go the way of what we now call MMA. It was only after the fact that I learned there were tournaments. And I think I competed in my first tournament 3 weeks after starting to train. And I just wrestled everybody until I got armbarred. Like, I didn't even know what the fuck happened to me. I screamed the first time I got caught in a tournament. But that was always a way to add pressure to the process of getting ready for fights, in reality. It was always just a tool. Well, here's the thing about the inevitability of comfort. When you remove the possibility of death in a martial arts scenario, you make it safe for different tangents of evolution to occur. Will a current sport jiu-jitsu world champion be able to win a street fight? Well, of course he will, because he trains, because he's probably in shape, because he knows how to stay on top. So there are things that, of course, he's going to be capable of that. And for me, any criticisms I've had of the sport world have been criticisms of deficiency, not criticisms of ineptitude or just the inability to be functional. It's like, no, it's just that they are specialists. And my specialty, if I have one, has always tried to be violence, has always tried to be, what's the scenario that exploits my deficiencies currently, and how do I train to be able to improve them? I was a black belt for some years already in jiu-jitsu when I first was introduced to SIOC. The epiphany that I had that led me to start training in SIOC Kali was I was with my wife and I think 2 kids at the time, and we were in a parking lot for a supermarket in the Bronx. And there was a guy walking through the parking lot that wasn't an attacker, he wasn't a bum or something, but I hadn't seen him. And as we're getting ready to load the car, he walked out of between cars in a place where I didn't know somebody was there, and it startled me. And that led me to start running the scenarios like, what if that guy had a knife? Here I am with my wife and 2 kids. What's the jiu-jitsu move for this? And that started saying or reminding me, your training still needs to continue. You aren't done. Admittedly, I won some tournaments. I won some MMA fights. My school was successful and was growing. So it was so comfortable for me, just like the removal of real violence allows the sports specialization to occur. Well, the removal of having to be violent in a reality type setting for me, because of the success of what I was having, also allowed me to start specializing and I would say eroding my original mission of being as effectively prepared for reality as I can. So I was in a business group at the time, and I find out one of the guys teaches SIOC Kali. Now, I had heard of SIOC, and Nick Sakulis was the guy that was in the group. And I had heard of SIAC from the movie The Hunted, and here and there, people would mention it. And I heard he taught it, and I basically like imposed myself on him. And I was like, "Hey, Nick, what's up? Yeah, I hear you teach SIAC. Yeah, you're gonna start teaching me." He has a school in Queens. I was in the Bronx at the time, and he begrudgingly at some point agreed to start doing privates with me, and I was just blown away. Nick had done some jujitsu. I think he was a blue belt or a purple belt at the time in jujitsu. He had done a bunch of kickboxing, so Nick could fight. So it checked that box. He wasn't like some weapons weirdo, right? Because you get a lot of these weapons weirdos. So in my eyes, like he was a guy that could fight. But then when I saw what he could do with a blade, training blades is with training, it's like, holy shit. I run into this guy, like I'm pretty confident I'm tapping Nick 10 out of 10 times in a grappling setting. You put knives in our hands, I might as well give him my knife at the time. And I'm going to get sliced and diced and have absolutely no say in the matter. So it was just a mind-blowing experience for me. And it opened my eyes even further. I eventually then got plugged into the SIAC system. I got to train enough to be grateful for, certainly not as much as I would have liked, with Pamana Tuhan SIAC, who eventually passed. And then I got into the LOT training that SIAC has, which changed my mental approach to how I created paradigms and how I processed, obstacles and problems and issues. And so it even made me a more formidable martial arts practitioner in every area, the mental training of SIAC. So not only was I then training blades, but then I was able to connect with Tom Kyer, Tom Kyer, and that's when I started my shooting training. And have trained in firearms, varying types of firearms. To me, the process of being a martial artist is always, I'm going to continue to find the pressure that's going to forge me into a slightly harder version of the warrior that I am. What's lost in a lot of my criticisms of sport jiu-jitsu, because that's the world that I'm most adjacent to. What's lost is that I am a great fan of sport jiu-jitsu. I watch sport jiu-jitsu almost every day, matches and techniques and stuff. I'm still like enamored and in love with the evolution of those things. Where I draw the line, however, it's like, hey, listen, like guys, we still have to learn how to fight, though. We still have to learn how to do violence. And that is where I just deviate from the sport evolutions of any martial art, really. I could appreciate them, I could participate in them, but they don't define the identity of what exists as the greater context around what it is that I'm doing. When I started a school, it created another hurdle for me, in that now this thing that I loved, martial arts training, I remember one of the earlier business models I developed years after I started a school. I had the awareness to be able to draw this Venn diagram where one circle was, I called it good martial arts. The other circle was good business, and they overlapped. And the intersection, that's what I labeled as my target as an owner. I want to do good business. I want to make money, but I also want to be a good instructor, create a good environment. And if I looked at my 20 plus years owning a school, it's always been sort of hovering in and out of that intersection on other sides. There are times where I become so motivated to grow the business. I've done things that I've noticed, all right, these guys are turning into pussies. But I've done other things where it's like, I didn't give a fuck about the business, and I start adding pressure. And I start letting my more natural Pai Mei style of coaching to surface. And I would just break guys, melt guys. Not personally, physically, just the pressure of training just became too much for them. And it wasn't even that they couldn't take it, some of them. It's that that's not what they were here for. Which was always something that I didn't understand. I certainly couldn't relate to. It's like, yeah, I don't want to, do the punching and stuff. I just want to do the grappling. It's like, but what grappling do you think exists in the real world without punching? Like, I didn't understand the premise that they were operating and developing these preferences from. But it was what they could do. It was what they could afford to do. And I don't mean financially, I mean societally. You don't have to be a man that knows how to deal with an armed assailant, in the aquarium of society. So if we don't ritualize it, it just falls by the wayside. If people stopped farming and stopped hunting and just relied on all the different sources, the modern technologically backed sources that provide these things for us, at some point we'll forget how to do it. And that makes us more vulnerable, makes us more controllable because we're more malleable. It's like the whole racket of a mafia family charging people protection money. The irony, of course, being the protection was from them if they didn't pay the money. It's like, why could the mob do that? It's because the people weren't strong enough to resist it. One of my favorite movies of all time, The Seven Samurai. A bunch of villagers are constantly having their harvest stolen by this gang of bandits. So the villagers, put their coins together and they hire 7 mercenaries, right? The 7 samurai. And the movie obviously is the samurai eventually engaging and dealing with these bandits. It's like the samurai were walking around. They had their own problems. They needed to do this to make money. But the villagers, they would have just had their shit taken from them if they didn't have somebody to protect them. So as an individual, as a man, I look at that sort of dichotomy of the farmers and the warriors, and it's like we need to be able to provide. We need to be able to do these things and operate in the aquarium to some extent. All of us do. We have some sort of hybrid lifestyle. I'm not moving into the fucking woods right now. Like the guys who, they live off grid and, they're living like the way we lived in history. Meanwhile, they got fucking solar things, batteries. They got a fucking a tractor, like whatever the case is. Like everything's some setting on the spectrum of being a hybrid. We're not all natural, right? But we're not in the matrix pods yet either, right? So we're somewhere between those. But when I look at individuals who just think, I don't need to learn martial arts, I don't need a firearm. I don't need a weapon. I have people that I had a guy a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was last week, who was chastising a clip that I had shared talking about, an armed society being a polite society. And you could just tell, and he might have even been American, but he was referencing Japan, and Japan, they don't have weapons, but they have, all of these the cultural amenities, and everybody's nice and respectful, and living there is so pleasant, and you could leave your bike without chaining it up and nobody's going to take it. And it's like, well, this is, I like to say, a multivariate dilemma, right? So you could say it's, well, I could say in rebuttal to that, it's because they're Japanese people, right? Meaning they're a homogenous, I would argue, low-T society at this point. That they're going to get along with each other. They've also been inundated with this oppressive sort of feedback from post-World War II powers to become a society that can exist despite the fucking boot on their neck that they had to develop. It gets into a bigger topic, but to say that the society is this way, number one, says it speaks nothing of freedom. It speaks nothing of a man's protected rights to go and pursue his own interests. It also speaks nothing of what they're exposed to, what they're vulnerable to. It doesn't mention their immigration policies. It doesn't. So multivariate dilemma, right? But to me, when you remove all of the machinations of laws and regulations and the cultural conformities that are codified by governments and such, and you just look at the nature of man, every bit of comfort that you have is usually traded for the drive and instinct you had to exist without that comfort. Comfort makes us weaker. I consider myself to be a strong man, but very relative in a lot of ways. Like, I understand my limitations. Right now I'm 250 pounds. I should not be 250 fucking pounds. Operationally, if shit went sideways and I had to do violence and move and do all these different things, I'm at a deficiency right now. I'm training. Don't worry about it. There's always a plan. I'm always on the road. I just fall off sometimes, right? But that being said, I'm under no delusions that because I'm a MMA fighter, black belt in jiu-jitsu, school owner, I know how to use a blade. I know how to shoot a pistol. I'm not saying that I'm good. Like, the whole point of it is it never stops. If there's any message I want to convey from this talk is being a martial artist means it never stops. And what adds context to what happens next is not another generation of specialization. It is, on the contrary, a recalibration and pivot towards our deficiencies. In other words, once I become proficient, even to a level of expert, or I've achieved some level of mastery in a particular discipline, whatever that threshold is that I cross, we have to remind ourselves, okay, now it's time to do the other thing. Now, what's the value of this, aside from the practical value of living the life of a warrior who's ready to do violence if necessary to protect his people? I would argue it's all the other benefits that were attributed to martial arts training. When I first started the Jungle Gym, I'll admit, I called it a gym because Straight Blast Gym, friend of mine, Matt Thornton, his title for Straight Blast Gym had a bunch of reasons behind it. My use or repurposing of that naming convention of calling it a gym was that I didn't want it to be what I saw were these, what I would call these McDojo, cookie cutter martial arts things where there was not where they were formal necessarily. I didn't mind the formality. I had done judo before, right? Bowing and everything. And, even in SAC, there's a lot of formality I never had an issue with. To me, the thing was a lot of these McDojos didn't have any pressure. And they weren't preparing people for reality. It was just like a members only club where you just had your own shtick and your own mythology, So for me, it was, I needed to call my academy something in my eyes where they understood they were there to work. It wasn't a pushback against the formality. We don't bow, we don't do these things. But again, a lot of not including that was where I saw that being practiced. I saw people becoming enamored with the formality of it and completely discarding the utility of it. So that's why I had named it the Jungle Gym. Jungle, why jungle? My wife and I were driving past the Bronx Zoo one day on the way to train. And I look over, I'm telling her, like, we got to think of a name. I wanted a gym. I mentioned the whole thing with Straight Blast Gym. And then I look over and there's a jungle exhibit going on. I see the sign and I say Jungle Gym. And I said, Jungle Gym. She looks and she was like, that's it. And I get to class like 20 minutes later and I tell everybody the name of the school we're changing to Jungle Gym. That's how that was born. But that's why it was called the gym. Years later, and I literally mean years later, somebody told me, oh yeah, I know why you created the Jungle Gym. And I said, why? The name it. And I said, why? And they said, Justin Garcia Jungle Gym. And up until that point, I had never even realized it, which is like one of those, oh yeah, my subconscious maybe realized it, but I didn't have a fucking clue consciously. So there is a point where, when I look at martial arts, remember I started this whole thing and I'll start to conclude a little bit. I see a couple of questions. I'll hit them if they're there. But what is martial arts to me? Martial arts is creating a commitment to pressure oneself in a process that makes one more formidable in a setting, an environment of violence. There's got to be pressure. There's got to be violence. And when I look at the sort of branches into sport that just about every martial art experiences at some point, if I were to overlay that on my ladder metaphor, when people start opting for sport over utility, reality-based utility, it's what I've attributed to the mindset of falling in love with a rung. At some point, we're climbing the ladder, we're getting more powerful, we're improving, we're experiencing progress, whatever our criteria for that is. But at some point, we get to a point where it's like, oh man, I really like this one. You know what? I'm not going to climb anymore. I don't need to climb. I'm high enough on the ladder. This is good. Let's stay here. Let's call this the top. To me, that's what a lot of sports evolution is. The individuals that do sport, like, listen, like I've won tournaments before. I've won MMA matches before. So it's not that I'm not even decent or effective in sports. To me, it's, like I could still do all the other things though. So it's not mutually exclusive. But when I say now, and again, I'm going to use the sport jiu-jitsu world to draw a contrast because that's the identity or the culture that I'm most adjacent to. I see sport jiu-jitsu schools as fundamentally just doing something different than what I do. And if they enjoy it, that's fine. I see, I was on a website a couple of weeks ago, and the instructors, somebody had sent me a link asking me about this school, and I clicked on it. And one of the instructors had on the website his name and then he, him, like his pronouns. And, obviously there's just that visceral, immediate reaction where it's like, what the fuck is that have to do? But then it's like, okay, second step strategies. Let me add a little bit of context. And it's like, if this is what he wants to do and these people are okay with that, then good for them. Because it has nothing to do with my mission. So I look at a lot of sport jiu-jitsu schools today, and they don't do what I do. They're not committed to the same process that I've lived my life around. And that, I would say, is what martial arts means to me. Right? So what do we got here? '59 level OPID. What's up? Yarn Saxo, what's up? Good to see you. Cody says, hey, bro, I'm trying to get into MMA. Got anything that would help me? So my advice for finding the path to MMA is to join an MMA school. Join an MMA school that has a track record of taking people like you and getting them to fight MMA. Understand that the level at which you want to participate in MMA is going to be reflected in the commitment your entire life has to doing that. Anybody that wants to become an MMA champion at this point, I would say you need to sort of, to simplify it, you need to design a life that resembles an MMA monk. It's not for everybody. But at this point, the world of MMA, it's exploded. And one of the reasons it's exploded, there's a lot of money in it. And as soon as the big money's into it, it becomes a different animal. It starts to become more regulated. It starts to become more restricted. What is more entertaining trumps what is much more effective. And guys can win fights and get cut from organizations, even though they won, because they didn't win in an entertaining way. Guys that lose fights, not forever, but they'll lose fights, but they're super entertaining, they'll be kept along. So there's an entertaining component to the identity of MMA at the highest levels. But I would say, regardless, if you're going to compete in MMA, you have to join a school that has a track record of showing that you could be, in MMA, because they've done it. They've done it with people like you. When I first fought MMA, prior to that, I had never even had an MMA class in my school. I was just of the mindset, it's like, listen, if I haven't done it, I'm not going to teach it. After I fought MMA is when I actually started using MMA in my marketing and talking about my school and such. Um, but at this point, like, I fought professionally. I've had a number of professional fighters. I've had a big MMA team at one point, and for me, it's like if you're going to fight MMA, like you need to join an environment that's going to pressure you to change from who you are to the version of you that wins MMA fights, right? So you need to be in the right environment, and there needs to be pressure. The other thing I would add, and I won't call out his name, but I knew a former UFC fighter that was not on my team, super nice guy, very charismatic, very talented, had absolutely no coachability. I remember being backstage with him. I had a guy fighting on the card, and we were sharing a big locker space, changing room space with him in his camp. And at one point, he started yelling at his coaches, like very diva-like. And this is prior to him making it to the UFC. And I remember looking at my students, some of which were coaches, one of was the guy that was fighting, and going, this is why he'll never get to where he's capable of. And I like the guy, like and super talented, just didn't have that coachability. You got to understand, if you know that pressure is what's going to bring you through the forging process to get to where you want to be, you got to also accept that sometimes that pressure has a face. And if you make pressure that's coming from a coach a personal thing, you're losing touch with the context of why he's there in the first place. I would pressure my guys and still pressure my guys. And a recurring thing that I remind them of is like, guys, you got to understand, I don't do this to make myself feel big and make myself feel like a boss. I just as soon fucking live with my friends and family in the fucking woods and not talk to anybody. Like, I don't have those drives and aspirations. I don't want to be famous, but I would tell them, I'm going to give you the pressure you need, but don't lose sight of the fact that if you're awesome as a result, I'm awesome. If you suck as a fighter, I suck as a coach. Not on an individual level, because there's some guys that were just fucking lemons, and I made the best taste lemonade you can make, but you get what you get. But in a general sense, if all my guys are terrible, I'm terrible. So any process that I'm using to prepare my guys, you could criticize it a whole bunch of ways. The one thing you can't say, though, is that it reflects a lack of commitment on my part to making them more formidable fighters, right? What else? So, Cody, I hope that's some useful advice. Do you sell that version of the gratitude shirt on your site? I believe it is. If it's not, I'll put it back up, because I just discovered on my call this morning, I got a hole in this one. So I got to order another one. So I believe it's up, but if not, I'll put it up. Jamie writes, science versus art, which is functional versus aesthetic. Exactly right. Absolutely right. Because there's also something to be said for, at this point, you want to be the most formidable warrior you could be, learn how to fucking fly a drone. Like, there's that, right? The problem is, I would say, some of the more technologically enhanced forms of warfare, and this predates drones. This gets into, we could argue, firearms to some extent, or any other long-range type of technologically driven weaponry. You don't have that same warrior ethos that's forged in cultures that specialize in that technology. So there's a point where you're talking about drones. It's guys in rooms playing video games, and they could do just exponentially more damage than the greatest ancient armies could have managed. Because of the payloads, now they can deliver it with the drones and all these different things. But the guy that's playing that video game isn't a hard man. He is not a hard warrior. He hasn't gone through those identity connected trials and tribulations that most martial artists are forged by. right? So that's the trade-off for technology. So even if I had guys playing video games with drones in a room, if I am the guy running that system, there's still going to be a physical component to their training for no other reason than the ritualized retaining of the warrior ethos, right? So all of these dynamics are at play, so it's like, yeah, I know how to use firearms, I know how to use a blade, but there's a point where technology just gets you to the point where I don't even have to look at people anymore. I don't have to get tired. Like, technology will let you kill 1,000 people without ever getting tired. That is not natural, right? Which means, you have that output that's generated in a way that your body, physiology, isn't even engaged with, right? So again, these are just variables to be managed. Willie, what's up, brother man? Tom writes, for me, one of the most important things about sport is it allows men to understand that they can lose. Without ever sparring or being in a sport where there's a winner and loser in combat, a lot of men who never competed think they're going to win just because they get angry or just because they want it. That's right. And I would anchor a more general application of that to consequence. Losing is the application of consequence on, in a one-on-one contest of some sort. But consequence is when I do things, these are the consequences that result. It's like, if you want to win a fight, if I'm 50% angry and I lost the fight, it is illogical, or certainly not rooted in reality, if it's for me to say, well, if I was at 100% anger, then I would win the fight. This does not correlate to that. Obviously, if I lost a fight, I did something less than I should have done it. So that is the process. So it's very reality based, and it's input output. And in a tournament in sport, specific to what Tom was referencing, losing adds that. It's like, yeah, how much you want it is irrelevant. I just released in my Mastermind group a couple of days ago something called the Dominion cycle. And one of the things I meant to explain or offer in the Dominion cycle was this, at a civilization scale, this just cyclical, process that is represented in the old, hard men create good times create soft men create bad times, like that cycle. And I just populated that process in a way that I feel you could observe in history. And the point of me doing that is, it shouldn't ever be, I'm going to get to the point where I'm done, or I get to the point where we figured it out. It's all cyclical, right? So you look at the formation of the United States, all these beefs over autonomy, representation, tyranny, whatever label you want to sort of use to describe it. A bunch of people started anew and they reset. And the United States of America was born out of that. My argument is, as soon as that reset occurred, we now entered the arc that eventually cyclically ends what we have, only to be exposed to all these tough times, times of scarcity I use in the model, to where it is reset till another group says, fuck this, we're starting over again. And then there's a reset. And this cycle happens throughout history at varying levels of scale. I used a civilizational scale to illustrate the cycle. But the point of it is, stop thinking you're going to get to the point where you're done. There's always the next thing. I use as an example of this commitment to a standard that in the Norse, tradition, somebody gets brought to Valhalla not when they win every war, but it's when they die in war trying to give everything they have to win it. It's like you still have to die to get invited to Valhalla. And I think one of the underlying wisdoms in that tradition is, don't think you're getting out of this unscathed. It's, are you the most forged version of yourself that you can be? And for some people, it's mindset changes you need to make. Some people, skill, it's a skill issue, as the kids say, right? You don't know how to fight. Fucking weightlifters that got fucking biceps bigger than their fucking craniums, who they can't go 30 seconds without having a fucking heart attack. But then you have the other guys that are physically strong, have the training, but just don't have the ability to apply what they know. And then you have age, which is eroding some things, giving you the opportunity to develop others. And it's like, yeah, in a perfect world, all the elderly of my tribe are on drones. Right? It's like they're on drones. They're all taking some Adderall or something to stay focused. But you look at their history, and they were fucking skull crushers, up until that stage, But that's the, my perfect design of it, right? Aaron says, I didn't see it there, but I'll check again. All right. Oh, the gratitude shirt. I promise you, I'll put it up before the day's over, because like I said, I have to order one too. All right, guys. Man, I'm fucking going over an hour already. Great talk. Like I said, I didn't have a framework really to use. I mentioned a couple things in the email that I made sure I touched on. But aside from that, I just wanted to get that out there. I just wanted to tell about my story, why I became a martial artist, the beginnings of it, what I see my martial arts journey as being, and even when it comes to the martial arts academy that I have, why I don't see myself as better or worse than other arts or other versions of the arts that I teach. It's just different. And what I explained today is the mission that I try to keep my students on. All right. I appreciate you guys. Great talk. I'll see you guys next week. And as always, brothers and sisters, pressure to power.